Horse stands in middle of highway. When traffic stops, everyone is stunned. Why do you think the horse is standing in the middle of the highway? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. It was the kind of evening where everything felt still, ordinary, routine, predictable. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the bustling highway. Cars weaved in and out of lanes, headlights flickering on like synchronized fireflies. For most drivers, it was just another commute home, a chance to escape the day's stress and settle into the comfort of their evening plans. But then, something unexpected happened. A strange silhouette appeared ahead, a shadow that didn't seem to belong on the busy road. Drivers blinked, unsure if what they were seeing was real. Cars began to slow, headlights illuminating the figure more clearly. A horse. It stood there, right in the middle of the highway, calm and unmoving, as if it had every right to be there. A ripple of confusion spread among the cars as more and more people realized the same thing. This wasn't a stray deer darting across the road. It wasn't a fleeting glimpse of wildlife that would vanish just as quickly as it appeared. No, this was a full-grown horse, standing tall, almost regal, in the path of dozens of vehicles. Somewhere behind the wheel of a compact sedan, Emily tapped her brakes, her brow furrowing. "Is that a horse?" she murmured to herself. She wasn't alone. Passengers in other cars craned their necks. Families peered out their windows. Honks blared sporadically, a mix of warning and frustration. "Why isn't it moving?" a driver shouted from a truck nearby, his voice muffled by his rolled-up window. But the horse remained still, its muscles relaxed, its expression unreadable. It wasn't panicking. It wasn't fleeing. It simply stood, and as more cars ground to a halt, it became clear that the animal had no intention of leaving the road. For a moment, people hesitated. Nobody wanted to get out of their car. After all, horses were powerful creatures, majestic but unpredictable. What if it spooked? What if it bolted straight towards someone? The unknown made them cautious. Then, a smaller figure emerged beside the horse, stepping into the golden glow of the setting sun. A foal. The tiny creature stood close to the adult horse's side, its legs wobbly but determined, as if it had gathered all the bravery in the world to join its parent. There was something almost heartbreaking about the sight, a young, fragile life following a protector into the middle of chaos. "Oh my God," Emily whispered, her hand flying to her mouth as she watched. Around her, people's faces softened. It wasn't just a horse blocking the highway anymore. There was a story unfolding, one they didn't yet understand. At first, nobody moved. Nobody knew what to do. But then, an older man in a blue pickup truck parked on the shoulder. He opened his door, stepped out cautiously, and began walking toward the animals. He wasn't reckless, he moved slowly, arms out to his sides in a gesture of peace. "Easy there," he called softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of idling engines. "Easy." The mare, for that's what she appeared to be, turned her head slightly, acknowledging his presence. Her ears flicked forward, alert but calm. It was as if she were watching him, judging his intentions. Behind her, the foal pressed closer, its small body trembling ever so slightly. The man, his name was Tom, though nobody there knew it yet, stopped a few yards away. He squinted, studying the animals. Something about them didn't add up. A horse and foal in the middle of a highway? It wasn't normal. They weren't wild, he could tell that much. Their coats were clean, well kept. The mare's hooves looked recently trimmed. These were domesticated animals, clearly cared for. So what were they doing here? "Anyone call animal control yet?" a woman shouted from her car, breaking the momentary silence. Tom glanced over his shoulder. "Don't think they'll get here fast enough," he muttered. He turned back to the horses, his mind racing. The mare's calm demeanor struck him as unusual. Most animals would have fled the moment cars started honking. This one, she wanted to be here. It was almost as if she were trying to send a message. "Something's wrong," Tom said aloud, though he wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. More drivers had gotten out of their cars by now, curiosity overcoming caution. A small crowd gathered near the shoulder, watching intently. Someone was on their phone, likely calling for help. Others murmured theories to one another, their imaginations running wild. Maybe they escaped from a nearby farm. What if the foal is injured? Or maybe they're lost. Tom didn't pay much attention to the chatter. He was focused entirely on the mare. Carefully, he took another step forward, lowering his voice even more. "Hey girl, you okay? You trying to show us something?" The horse blinked, her dark eyes locking with his for a brief moment. It felt almost intentional, like she understood him. Then slowly, deliberately, she turned her head to the side, glancing toward the edge of the highway. Tom frowned, following her gaze. There was nothing there at first glance, just a strip of grass leading to a dense thicket of trees. But the mare turned her head again, this time shifting her entire body slightly, nudging the foal to follow her movement. "She's pointing at something," Tom said under his breath. He looked back at the crowd. Did anyone see where they came from? A young man holding a camera spoke up. "I was a few cars back when I first saw them. They walked onto the road from the trees over there." Tom followed the man's gesture, squinting toward the tree line. It was a narrow patch of woods separating the highway from what looked like an empty lot. The sun was lower now, casting long streaks of gold through the branches. For a split second, Tom thought he saw something, just a flicker of movement deeper in the trees. "Stay here," he said firmly, looking back at the crowd. "Keep an eye on them." "What are you doing?" Someone called after him as he started walking toward the trees. Tom didn't answer. He didn't know what he was doing exactly, but his gut told him there was more to this than anyone realized. The mare had chosen to stand in the road. She'd refused to move, even when dozens of cars surrounded her, and now she was pointing him towards something. He stepped off the highway and into the grass, the sound of the world fading slightly as he moved toward the tree line. Behind him, he could feel the mare's eyes following his every step. Tom pushed through the tall grass, the noise of the highway muffled as he got closer to the tree line. The air seemed different here, heavier, as if the trees themselves held a secret. Behind him, he could still hear faint murmurs from the crowd and the occasional honk of a car, drivers who hadn't quite figured out why traffic had come to a standstill. But Tom didn't look back. His focus was entirely ahead, on the patch of woods that seemed to call to him. As he crossed into the shadows of the trees, he could feel the temperature drop. Sunlight still cut through in streaks, but it didn't warm him as it had out on the road. For a moment, he hesitated, wondering if he was chasing a fool's errand. But then he remembered the way the mare had looked at him. There had been something intentional in her gaze, something almost human. "Let's see what you're hiding," he muttered. The ground beneath him was soft, damp from a recent rain. Branches cracked under his boots, and as he walked, he scanned the area for anything unusual. Nothing stood out at first, just fallen leaves, tangled underbrush, and the occasional rustle of wildlife moving deeper into the woods. And then he saw it. About 30 feet ahead, just beyond the thinnest layer of branches, there was something unnatural, a faint glimmer of light reflecting off something metallic. Tom's heart picked up pace. He moved more quickly now, pushing branches aside, the tips scratching at his arms as he made his way through. When he finally broke into a small clearing, he froze. Truck. It was an old, rusted pickup, its paint chipped and faded. The vehicle had clearly been there a while, its tires sunk halfway into the soft earth as if nature itself were trying to reclaim it. The windshield was dirty, streaked with mud and leaves, and the cab's interior looked dark and empty. Tom's brow furrowed. What in the world? He took a cautious step forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the scene. There was no sign of anyone around, no footprints or paths leading in or out. It was as if the truck had simply appeared here and been forgotten. But as he circled around to the front of the vehicle, something else caught his eye, a faint trail in the dirt, barely visible, leading away from the truck and toward a deeper part of the woods. Tom's stomach tightened. It wasn't just the horse's strange behavior that had drawn him here. Something about this place felt off. He took a deep breath and followed the trail. The underbrush grew thicker the farther he went, branches snapping and pulling at his clothes as if to warn him to turn back. But he didn't. The trail was too deliberate. Someone or something had come this way recently. And then, just as suddenly as before, he found himself in another small clearing. The sight before him made him stop cold. A small shelter, barely more than a lean-to made of sticks and a tattered tarp, sat tucked between two trees. It looked hastily constructed, as if someone had thrown it together in desperation. Nearby, a bucket and a pile of firewood sat undisturbed, and a ripped blanket had been spread out on the ground. It was clear someone had been living here. Tom's heart sank. "Is someone out here?" he called, his voice hesitant but firm. The woods gave no answer. The silence pressed in around him, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Tom glanced around, his eyes darting from tree to tree, searching for any sign of movement. And then a sound, a faint, whimpering cry, reached his ears. Tom's head snapped toward the sound, his heart pounding. It was soft, muffled, and almost easy to miss, but it was there. He moved toward it slowly, his boots sinking into the damp earth. As he approached the back of the shelter, he spotted something beneath the ripped blanket, a small, trembling shape barely visible through the frayed fabric. Tom's breath caught in his throat. Oh no. He crouched down, his hands moving carefully as he lifted the edge of the blanket. And there, curled up tightly, was a small child, a boy, no older than 4 or 5. His face was streaked with dirt, his clothes torn and damp. He looked up at Tom with wide, frightened eyes, clutching a stuffed animal so worn it was barely recognizable. "Hey there, buddy," Tom said softly, his voice shaking as he tried to keep calm. "It's okay. You're okay now." The boy didn't speak. He just stared, his chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. Tom's mind raced. How had this child ended up here? How long had he been alone? And where were his parents? Gently, Tom reached out a hand. "I'm here to help, okay? You don't have to be scared." The boy hesitated for a moment, but then slowly, he uncurled, his small fingers loosening their grip on the stuffed animal. Tom scooped him up carefully, cradling him as he stood. The child weighed almost nothing, his body too light, too fragile. Tom turned and hurried back toward the highway, his heart pounding with urgency. "Hang on, kid. We're getting you out of here." Tom pushed through the woods as quickly as he could, cradling the boy in his arms. Every step felt like a small victory, a step closer to safety. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on him, more so than the physical effort of carrying the child. How long had he been out here alone? Why hadn't anyone found him sooner? The horse. Tom realized suddenly. That mare must have been guarding the boy, staying close to ensure he wasn't left completely alone. And when she saw Tom stop on the highway, something had told her he was the one who could help. It felt unbelievable, almost surreal, but Tom had no time to dwell on it. As he broke through the tree line and back into the open air of the highway, the gathered crowd gasped collectively at the sight before them. "Oh my God!" Someone shouted. "It's a child. He found a child." The police officers who had been trying to control the scene quickly rushed toward Tom, their radios crackling as they called for medical assistance. A paramedic, who must have arrived sometime during Tom's trek into the woods, appeared with a stretcher and a first aid kit. Tom carefully handed the boy over, his arms aching from the effort but his heart finally feeling some relief. He was under a blanket, out by an old shelter in the woods. Tom explained breathlessly to one of the officers. "He's been out there a while, I think. I don't know how long." The paramedic checked the boy's pulse and carefully wrapped him in a warm blanket. The child still hadn't spoken a word, but his wide eyes darted around the scene, taking in the flashing lights, the crowd of people, and the horse standing off to the side, her head turned toward him as if still watching over him. "She's the reason I found him," Tom added, nodding toward the mare. The officer looked from Tom to the horse, a skeptical expression flickering across his face. "The horse? You're telling me the horse led you to the kid?" Tom shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I'm telling you there's no other explanation." The officer didn't argue. Instead, he gave a quick nod and turned back toward his squad car, likely preparing to call in a report. The scene was chaotic now. Police moving quickly to coordinate a plan, paramedics readying the boy for transport, and onlookers murmuring among themselves as the full weight of the situation began to sink in. And then, just as quietly as before, the horse began to walk. Tom turned in surprise to see her heading back toward the woods, her steps deliberate but unhurried. She wasn't spooked or frightened. She was purposeful, as if she had finished her job and was ready to leave. "Wait," Tom called after her, jogging a few steps forward. "Where are you going?" The mare stopped, turning her head just enough to glance back at him. It was the same look as before, calm, knowing, grateful, before she turned once more and disappeared into the trees. Tom stood still for a long moment, watching the woods swallow her whole. He didn't know what to make of it. How had she found the boy? Why had she chosen to stay with him? And how, of all people, had she decided he was the one who could help? Hours later, after the commotion had died down and the child had been safely transported to the hospital, Tom sat in the back of an ambulance with a cup of lukewarm coffee in his hands. The officer he'd spoken with earlier returned, holding a small notebook. "You're not going to believe this," the officer said, shaking his head. "We got a call in last week. A woman reported her young nephew missing after he wandered off during a camping trip. They've been searching the woods for days." Tom's heart sank. "How far from here?" "About 10 miles, the officer replied. "It's incredible he made it this far on foot, but it sounds like he had some help." He looked at Tom pointedly, then glanced back toward the woods. "And from what you're telling me, that horse, whoever she belonged to, must have been keeping him alive." Tom stared into his coffee, his thoughts racing. 10 miles. That boy had wandered 10 miles through unfamiliar woods alone. And somehow, someway, the mare had been there to keep him safe. It wasn't just luck, it couldn't be. "So, what happens to him now?" Tom asked quietly. "The boy's being treated at the hospital. He's weak and dehydrated, but they say he'll be okay," the officer replied. "His family's on their way to see him now." Tom let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Relief washed over him, but it was tinged with something else, a deep sense of awe at what had unfolded that day. He couldn't explain it. No one could. When the officer finally walked away, Tom glanced back toward the woods one last time. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the grass. For a brief moment, he thought he saw movement among the trees, a flash of a silhouette, the faint glimmer of a mane catching the light, but when he blinked, it was gone. The horse was gone. And yet, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching, still out there, keeping a quiet vigil over the world she'd been trusted to protect. Tom spent the following days trying to settle back into his regular routine, but the memory of that afternoon lingered in his mind like an unfinished story. He couldn't stop thinking about the boy, about the mare, about the strange and unshakable feeling that he'd witnessed something extraordinary, something that couldn't be explained away as coincidence. The news of the boy's rescue had spread quickly, making headlines across the town and even gaining attention in the surrounding areas. Words like miraculous, incredible, and unbelievable were splashed across articles and news broadcasts, yet none of those descriptions felt sufficient to Tom. The mare's role, her quiet, persistent guidance, had been reduced to a footnote in the retelling, as if she were simply an odd detail in an otherwise heroic story. But Tom knew better. She was the hero. Sitting in his kitchen one evening, Tom found himself absent-mindedly scrolling through news coverage on his phone. The images of the boy, now recovering well in the hospital, brought a smile to his face. The doctors had said he'd been lucky, dehydrated and weak, but otherwise unharmed. Lucky? Tom almost laughed at the word. It wasn't luck, he thought. It was the horse. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Tom frowned and stood up, glancing at the clock. It was late, almost 9 p.m. Who would be stopping by this time of night? When he opened the door, he was surprised to see the police officer from the highway incident standing on his porch. "Evening, Tom," the officer said, removing his hat with a small nod. "Mind if I come in?" Sure," Tom replied, stepping aside. "Come on in." The officer followed Tom into the kitchen and took a seat at the table. His expression was serious, but there was something else there too, an undercurrent of curiosity. He placed a small folder on the table and slid it toward Tom. "I thought you'd want to see this," the officer said. Tom hesitated, then opened the folder. Inside were several black and white photographs, faded with age. The first one showed a small boy standing next to a horse. The horse? Even in the grainy photograph, Tom could recognize the mare's distinctive features, the deep brown coat, the calm and intelligent eyes. "This was taken nearly 40 years ago," the officer explained. "The boy in that picture was the son of a farmer who used to live in the area. His family raised horses, and this mare was one of them. According to the records, she was fiercely protective of the kids, almost like a guardian." Tom looked up sharply. "The same horse? That's impossible." The officer gave a small shrug. "That's what I thought too. But here's the thing, the family's farm was just a few miles from where you found that boy. And locals have been telling stories for years about a wild horse that roams the area, appearing when someone's in trouble." Tom's mind reeled as he looked back at the photo. The idea seemed absurd, a horse living for decades, watching over people like some kind of guardian spirit. And yet, wasn't that exactly what she'd done? She had stayed with that boy, refused to leave his side, and somehow led Tom to him in the end. "She's not just a horse," Tom murmured, almost to himself. "She's something else." The officer nodded, as if he'd been waiting to hear those words. "That's what folks around here believe. They call her the Sentinel." Tom's eyes widened. "The Sentinel?" "Yeah. There's a legend that she's been protecting these woods for longer than anyone can remember. Most people say it's just an old story, something to tell kids around a campfire. But after what you saw," the officer trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. Tom stared down at the photograph, his thoughts spinning. The Sentinel. A guardian. Protector. It was the only explanation that made sense, as impossible as it seemed. The following weekend, Tom found himself driving back out to the highway where it had all started. He didn't know what he expected to find, maybe nothing, but he felt compelled to return. He parked his truck on the shoulder and stepped out, squinting against the bright sunlight. The road was quiet now, the traffic flowing smoothly. There were no flashing lights, no crowds of onlookers, just the stillness of the woods stretching out on either side. Tom stood there for a long moment, breathing in the fresh air, then turned and walked toward the tree line. He moved slowly, carefully, as if he might disturb something sacred. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, but there was something else too. Presence. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but Tom could feel it. She's here. He couldn't explain how he knew, but he was certain of it. He stepped deeper into the woods, his eyes scanning the trees, his ears straining for any sound of movement. And then, just as he was about to give up, he saw her. The mare stood a short distance away, partially hidden by the shadows of the trees. Her gaze was fixed on Tom, calm and steady, just as it had been that day on the highway. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Tom felt a lump rise in his throat as he took in a sight of her, strong, proud, timeless. "Thank you," he whispered. The mare flicked her ears as if acknowledging his words, then turned and began to walk deeper into the woods. Tom didn't try to follow her. He knew that she would go where she was needed, watching over the forest and its secrets, appearing only when it mattered most. As Tom turned and walked back to his truck, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He would never fully understand what had happened that day, but he didn't need to. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. Some stories were meant to remain just that, stories. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the woods, the Sentinel stood watch, waiting for the next soul who needed her. As Tom walked back to his truck, his footsteps quiet on the soft forest floor, he couldn't shake the feeling of wonder that lingered in his chest. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he'd been part of something bigger, something ancient and unexplainable. It was humbling, but it was also strangely comforting. The legend of the Sentinel wasn't just a story. It was real. The mare had been there that day, not just as a horse lost on the highway, but as a guardian, carrying out some unspoken duty. Tom couldn't help but think of all the people she might have saved over the years, stories lost to time, people who had walked away safe but never understood why. He realized how lucky he was to have seen her in action, to have been part of her quiet heroism. As he climbed into his truck and started the engine, he cast one last look toward the tree line. The mare was gone now, hidden in the depths of the forest. But she was there. She would always be there. Over the next few weeks, Tom found himself revisiting the story of the Sentinel more often than he cared to admit. He spoke with old-timers at the local diner, asking if they'd ever heard of the legend. The answers he got were vague, bits and pieces of old folklore mixed with personal stories that all seemed to hint at the same thing. Back in the 60s, my granddad said he saw a horse lead a lost hiker out of the woods. One man said, stirring sugar into his coffee. Crazy thing was, they searched that whole forest the day before and didn't find a trace of him. Then, boom, there he is. Said a horse walked him out like it knew the way. I heard a story about a boy who fell into a ravine near Pine Creek. An older woman chimed in. Nobody knew how he got out alive, but when they found him, he said a brown mare had been standing by him all night. He swore she wouldn't leave until help came. The stories varied in the details, but the thread that connected them was unmistakable. A horse, appearing in moments of desperation, leading people back to safety. Tom could hardly believe how widespread the tale was. People from all over the area seemed to know about the Sentinel, yet no one could explain her. That's just how legends work, one man shrugged. You see enough, you stop asking questions. But Tom couldn't stop asking questions. He couldn't stop thinking about the boy and how close he'd come to tragedy, how it had been the sentinel who had prevented it. Why him? Why the boy? Tom didn't have answers, but he knew he couldn't ignore what had happened. The memory of the mare's gaze lingered in his mind, steady and purposeful, like she knew more than any creature had a right to know. One evening, just before sunset, Tom drove back to the woods. It had become something of a habit, visiting the spot where he'd first seen her. He'd park his truck on the shoulder of the road and sit for a while, watching the cars pass, watching the light fade through the trees. It was quiet out there, and it felt like the kind of place where secrets could live forever. As the last light dipped below the horizon, Tom climbed out of his truck and approached the tree lean. He didn't expect to see her again. Part of him believed that the sentinel would only appear when she was truly needed, that she was far beyond his reach now. But just as he turned to leave, a rustle in the trees made him stop. His heart leapt in his chest as he turned back. Standing just a few feet away, half hidden by the shadows, was the mare. Her deep brown coat seemed to glow in the twilight, her eyes fixed on him with that same calm intensity. "Hey there," Tom murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He stepped forward, careful not to startle her, though something told him she wouldn't spook. She was too steady, too confident. "You came back." The mare didn't move, but she didn't turn away either. She stood perfectly still, her gaze locked on his, as if she were waiting for something. Tom wasn't sure what compelled him to speak, but he did. "Thank you," he said again, "for saving that boy. For saving all of us, I guess." The mare flicked her tail and lowered her head slightly, as if acknowledging his words. For a moment, Tom felt like a child again, like he was standing in the presence of something magical, something pure and untouchable. He wanted to step closer, to reach out and touch her, but he stopped himself. She wasn't just a horse after all. She was something more. Something sacred. "Keep doing what you're doing," Tom said softly. "The world needs you." The mare held his gaze for a moment longer before turning and disappearing into the woods. Tom stood there, frozen in place, long after she was gone. The forest seemed to close around him, erasing all trace of her presence, but he didn't feel sad. He felt honored. Years later, the legend of the Sentinel would remain alive, passed down through stories told in hushed voices and knowing smiles. People would continue to talk about the horse who appeared when she was needed most, who led the lost to safety and guarded those in danger. Some would say she was just a myth. Others would swear they'd seen her with their own eyes. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the forest, the sentinel would wait, watching, guarding, protecting, forever. Tom couldn't get the encounter with the mare out of his head. Days turned into weeks, and while life continued as usual, working his shifts, stopping by the diner for coffee, and fixing things around his small home, the memory of that quiet evening haunted him. It wasn't just that he'd seen her. It was that he felt something shift inside him. The sentinel wasn't a myth anymore. She was real, and he had no idea how many lives she'd touched. He wondered how many people just like him had seen her but never spoken a word of it, afraid they'd sound crazy, afraid no one would believe them. One afternoon, Tom found himself at the town library, rifling through old records and newspaper clippings. He didn't quite know what he was looking for, proof, maybe, or an explanation. Something to connect the pieces of the story that refused to leave his mind. The librarian, Mrs. Gordon, was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a soft voice. When she noticed Tom's growing stack of materials, she approached him with a curious smile. "You look like a man on a mission," she said. Tom glanced up, a little embarrassed. "I guess you could say that." "What are you trying to find?" she asked, peering at the crumbling clippings spread before him. "I've heard stories about a horse, a mare, out in the woods." He hesitated, feeling foolish for even saying it out loud. "A lot of people call her the Sentinel." "Ever heard of her?" The librarian's expression shifted, just slightly. She studied him for a moment, as if gauging how serious he was. Finally, she nodded. "I have." "You have." Mrs. Gordon walked to a nearby cabinet and unlocked it with a small key she retrieved from her necklace. Tom watched as she pulled out an old, bound ledger and set it carefully on the table. "This," she said, brushing the dust from the leather cover, "is the record of strange happenings in this town. Stories passed down over generations. Not all of them are written down in newspapers, but that doesn't mean they didn't happen." Tom stared at the book, reverently turning the yellowed pages. Inside were handwritten accounts, careful cursive entries dated as far back as the early 1900s. "There are mentions of her here," Mrs. Gordon said, pointing to a passage near the center of the book. "Some folks believe the sentinel to be a guardian of the forest, while others thought she was something more. A spirit, maybe." Tom read the entry aloud. March 3, 1912. A boy found in the western woods, claimed to be led back by a brown mare with a star-shaped mark on her forehead. Search parties had been combing the area for days with no luck. The horse disappeared into the trees as soon as he was safe. He flipped the page. Another entry. June 5, 1947. A traveler stranded in a snowstorm stumbled upon an open path led by a horse, despite no tracks being found later. The horse is said to have saved his life. Every account followed the same pattern. A lone horse appearing to people in need, always guiding them to safety before disappearing without a trace. Tom sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. "She's been here for over a century. Maybe longer," Mrs. Gordon said softly. "People in this town have always respected the woods. There are stories older than these, told by families who've lived here for generations. It's as if she's always been here watching." Tom ran his hand over the book's pages, still trying to process it all. He didn't know why it mattered so much, but it did. The sentinel was more than a horse. She was a legacy, a mystery woven into the fabric of the town itself. "Why me?" he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "Why did I see her?" Mrs. Gordon gave him a thoughtful look. "Sometimes we see things when we're ready to see them. Maybe she knew you were meant to be part of the story." As the weeks passed, Tom couldn't help but share the story, carefully and only with people he trusted. He expected disbelief or laughter, but he found something else. People who nodded quietly, as if they too had heard whispers of the sentinel. His friend Mike, a local mechanic, pulled him aside one evening. "You remember my uncle, right? The one who got lost in the woods back in the 80s. He told me something before he passed. Said a horse saved him. I never believed him, until now." A young woman at the diner, someone Tom barely knew, overheard a conversation and approached him with tears in her eyes. "My grandmother told me a story once about a horse that stayed by her father's side when he fell from a tree. He broke his leg and couldn't move, but the horse never left until someone came. She said the horse watched over him." It seemed like everyone in town had heard a version of the story. No one could explain it, but they all believed it. One evening, as a light drizzle fell over the town, Tom decided to drive back to the woods. This time, he wasn't hoping to see her, he just wanted to pay his respects. He parked his truck at the edge of the highway and sat in the silence for a while, listening to the rain tapping softly against the windshield. Finally, he stepped out and made his way toward the tree lean. The forest felt different tonight, quieter, as if holding its breath. Tom stopped just at the edge and looked into the darkness. "She's here, isn't she?" he whispered to no one in particular. There was no sound, no sign of movement, but Tom felt it, the same humbling presence he'd felt before. He smiled to himself and turned back toward his truck. The sentinel didn't need to appear for him to know she was there. She always would be. Years later, long after the boy he'd saved had grown up and moved on, the story of the sentinel remained. Tom became known as the man who'd witnessed her firsthand, and while he never claimed to understand it, he never stopped telling her story. "She's out there," he'd say to anyone who asked. "When you need her most, she'll find you." And so the legend lived on, passed from one generation to the next, a quiet promise that somewhere in the shadows of the forest, a guardian watched over them all. For those who believed, the sentinel was not just a horse. She was hope, she was protection, and she was a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary things exist in the quietest places. Somewhere, in a forgotten corner of the world, a brown mare stood watch, waiting, watching, for the next soul who would need her.